There are a couple of seats in the front. If you want to come and sit here, please join us. The seats here. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. It gives me a great pleasure to chair this meeting. This is a very special meeting for us because it's a book launch for Aaron David Miller. He wrote the book at the center last year before I had my ordeal in Iran. I had read a couple of his chapters, and then when I came back, there was the manuscript finished and in print. So it's a very dear manuscript to my heart because I saw it being born and then finished too. Aaron is currently a public policy scholar at the center, and he, as you know, is the author of this book, America and the Much to Promised Land, the Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. Between 2003 and 2006, he served as president of Seeds of Peace, and for the previous 2 decades, he served as an advisor to 6 Secretary of States, helping formulate U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process. He served as Deputy Special Middle East Coordinator for Arab-Israeli negotiations, senior member of the State Department Policy Planning, and has received the Department Distinguished Superior and Meritorious Honor. His articles have appeared in various newspapers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the International Herald Tribune. It gives me also great pleasure to introduce our 2 other speakers, Ambassador Sam Lewis, who is currently the Senior Policy Advisor to the Israel Policy Forum and visiting professor at Hamilton College. Ambassador Lewis spent a total of 34 years in the Foreign Service. He was United States Ambassador to Israel for 8 years, and during his tenure as Ambassador to Israel, he participated in the Camp David peace negotiations with former President Jimmy Carter, former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and former PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat. He also served as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff under former President Clinton at the time of the Oslo Agreement. Ambassador Lewis served as the first president of the United States Institute of Peace. Marvin Kalb, I don't think I need to introduce him, but he's the Edward R. Murrow Professor Emeritus at Harvard University and founding director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School of Government. Currently, he's the Welling Presidential Scholar at George Washington University and the host of the Kalb Report, a monthly public policy forum at the National Press Club. Mr. Kalb has received numerous awards for excellence diplomatic reporting, and he has authored 12 books, including 2 best-selling novels, and he's currently working on a book about how the Vietnam experience affected presidential decision-making. The format is going to be as follows. Aaron David Miller will speak for 15 minutes. We'll talk about his book, and then we will get comments by Ambassador Lewis and Mr. Kalb. And then we can proceed for a book signing and reception. Aaron?
Hala, thank you very much. A few thank yous are in order before I begin. Woodrow Wilson Center is a very special place. Woodrow Wilson was our only PhD president, and as I tell my academic audiences, I mean, I've got one of those degrees too. There may well be a reason for that, but the Woodrow Wilson Center, International Center for Scholars in Washington, is an extraordinary place. I've been fortunate now to be here for 2 years, and it has given me the support, the political space, and the time to write this book. Lee Hamilton sets a tone for this center which is remarkable. His wisdom and his integrity are really, truly impressive. Mike Van Dusen runs this place in a way that makes it sound and incredibly hospitable. And Hollis Fondiari is a remarkable woman with tremendous courage, tremendous integrity, and a phenomenal scholar. And it's an honor to consider you to be a friend. To Sam Lewis and to Marvin Kalb, men of great wisdom and experience, and friends, I really appreciate the fact that you're here. To my wife Lindsay and to my son Danny, who are here, there are very few words that I could use to express my gratitude and appreciation and love and support for them. Much to Promised Land had a very strange birth. I never intended to write the book. I resigned from the State Department in January of 2003, not because I was against the policy, but because I essentially concluded that the timeline for Arab-Israeli peace had been pushed way out into the future. And having more or less given up on the old generation, I went out to become president of Seeds of Peace and try to preside over an organization which worked with the younger generation. But as I watched in the years after 9/11 and saw America failing in a part of the world that was critical both to our national security and to the interests of our allies, something changed. The reasons for our failure are very complicated, and I don't believe, frankly, that we are primarily responsible for them. We confront a set of challenges in this region that are extraordinarily complex and have become even more complicated in the last decade. An authority deficit in Palestine and Lebanon and Iraq creates a situation where the small challenges central authority every day and makes America and its allies weak by comparison. The potential proliferation of weapons of mass destruction has created a serious challenge for this nation's security over time, and a series of unresolved conflicts, including a debate within Islam that has proven extremely complex, has created tremendous rage and hostility toward the United States. Some of it deserved, most of it, I would argue, not deserved. We are not primarily responsible for these failures, but it seemed to me as I looked at the situation that we somehow had made them worse. And I think largely because of two factors. First, we don't pay attention to history. The great British historian A.J.P. Taylor said that the only lesson of history is that there are no lessons. I think Taylor is wrong. I think history can be a cruel and unforgiving teacher if none of it is taken seriously. And second, we don't read the world as it is. We seem as Americans to read the world the way we want it to be. And these are two self-imposed problems which create, I think, serious problems in our foreign policy. Why is this the case? I mean, I believe that we are exceptional, not in an aggressive or arrogant way, although there are elements to our exceptionalism that clearly shape our policy in that regard. But we are situated in a way no great power in the history of the world has ever been situated. We alone, among the great powers on this earth, have had the luxury of non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and fish, literally fish, to our east and west. This single fact, in my judgment, explains more about why we behave the way we do with respect to the rest of the world. It gives us a pragmatism, it gives us an optimism, and it gives us a certain naivete, which I think inform much of the way we behave. We do not know what it's like, in my view, to literally live on the knife's edge. And this is not a Republican or a Democratic problem. this is an American problem. I would argue to you, and the book argues, that over the last 16 years, we have been unsuccessful in our Middle East policies, by and large, particularly on the Arab-Israeli issue. In fact, I would assert that the last time we had a serious foreign policy toward this particular problem was the President's father and his very able and talented Secretary of State, James Baker. And then it was only a 4-year run. It was almost impossible to determine what Bush and Baker would have done had they had another 4 years in the Middle East after putting together the Madrid Peace Conference. Much to Promised Land was an effort by me with as much clarity and honesty as I could marshal and muster to identify why we succeeded when we did over the course of the last 50 years and why we failed. It is not an I told you so. I was as much a cheerleader for failed policies as anyone else. And I'll borrow a line, as I do in the book, from Michael Jackson, not a great philosopher, who said that if you want to make a change in your life, and I would argue even in your foreign policy, the place to start, literally, is by looking in the mirror. And I think what is required, and it is in this spirit that I wrote this book, it is not an effort to attack, to criticize, and to engage in gratuitous self-flagellation. It is offered as an honest account of what it takes to succeed in Arab-Israeli diplomacy when we do, and why, in fact, we fail. I want to identify 4 or 5, I would argue, pretty obvious themes in the way of lessons, but just describe for a minute or two the conceit of the book. It's called The Much Too Promised Land because I argue that Palestine, and in large measure it focuses on the Arab-Israeli conflict and its core issue, the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians. Palestine was promised 4 times. First, by a Muslim, Christian, and Jewish God to their followers, at least those who were innocent enough and determined enough to follow. Same commitments to sacred space and territory. A second time by the British in the wake of the First World War in an effort to protect an empire from Suez to India. Conflicting promises were made to Zionists and Arab nationalists. A third time by the UN General Assembly in November 1947 when partition was promised. But it's the 4th promise that I focus in on this book. That promise was made by America. And that promise was essentially this. If you agree with our split the difference view of the world, our optimistic, practical, pragmatic view of the world, and if you work with us, embodied by the prime directive, it was a UN Security Council resolution, but for all practical purposes, it could have been an American resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 242, then we can't do it for you, but we will be there with you in body and spirit to help you get what neither God, the Brits, nor the UN could deliver. And this book is an effort to show what are the challenges in the wake of delivering on that promise, when that promise was kept, when it was frustrated, and when, in the final section, when it was abandoned, with a question mark. Those obviously were the years, the last 8 years. A couple additional points. I once believed that the key to protecting American interests in the Arab-Israeli, in the Middle East was a comprehensive peace between Arabs and Israelis. I don't believe that anymore. Too much water under the bridge. The complexities of this region are far more dangerous, consequential, and complicated. We will face challenges to our interests whether or not we can help broker peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. But I borrow the words as a baseball fan of Casey Stengel, who once said that the key to good management is keeping the 9 guys who hate your guts away from the 9 guys who haven't made up their minds. There are a great many people out in that region, Arabs and Israelis alike, who have not made up their minds about America. My contention is that this issue resonates with a ferocity and a power from one end of the Arab and Muslim world to the other, and managing it, particularly at a time when our national interests are threatened, should be, managing it with a view toward resolving it, if possible, should be a cardinal interest of the United States. For moral reasons, sure, but for reasons of our own national self-interest. I mentioned this is not an I told you so. One final comment on objectivity. And let me be very clear about this. There is no objectivity when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I've never met anyone, and I would put myself at the top of the list here, who can measure up to the gold standard of what it means to be objective. How could there be objectivity? We are all the sum total of our experiences, our ethnic and religious backgrounds, our predispositions, predilections. How could there be objectivity? The key is to try to determine where your biases are, set them aside, and in pursuit of an American national interest, try to understand what is required from each side in an effort to resolve this conflict. And I have tried in this book, and it's very clear and very honest, to reflect my own personal baggage and bias, and to show, I suspect, how it worked through various administrations. 6 lessons very quickly. No bricks without straw, to use a biblical, perhaps an unfortunate biblical metaphor. You cannot make bricks without straw. I don't care how much we want this, but unless there's the raw material forged in either crisis or opportunity, we will not succeed. We will not succeed. And that means looking at the 3 Americans who did succeed when America's promise was kept, Henry Kissinger, Jimmy Carter, and James Baker, to try to determine whether or not crisis and opportunity gave them the raw material to actually launch an effective diplomacy. And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. You needed urgency, you needed leadership, and you needed a willingness on the part of the parties, a predisposition to want to see this through, however complicated it was. Second, making bricks without straw, fine, but you need a brick maker. You need a brick maker. That doesn't mean the brick maker is always there at the beginning of the process. In the 3 examples of breakthroughs on the Arab-Israeli conflict, Egypt-Israel, Israel-Jordan, Israel-Palestine, we were nowhere to be seen. We were informed that Dayan was meeting with Tahami in 1977. We were informed. I was on vacation with my family in August of '93, call from the State Department Operations Center. It looks as if Israelis and Palestinians, with the benefit of the Norwegians, are about to conclude an agreement. And Israelis and Jordanians, even with the support of the Clinton administration, essentially came up with the formula for Israeli-Jordanian peace through a set of subterranean contacts which stretch back years, but certainly between 1992 and 1994. So you need a brick maker. Every successful example of a negotiated settlement that endured involved the United States at some role. I would argue that our best years, sadly, unfortunately, are behind us. Since 1991, we have failed to broker one agreement of consequence between Arabs and Israelis that have endured. Now, that's an arresting statement. Not one agreement of consequence since 1991 between Arabs and Israelis that have endured. A brickmaker needs to be empathetic, reassuring, but also incredibly tough. It's a very tough world. And successful diplomacy usually means pushing Arabs and Israelis farther than they might believe at the outset that they would have been willing to go. So it's not for the empathetic. It's for the empathetic and the tough. And my section on Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, America's Promise Kept, compares them quite irreverently. And they all, when I interviewed them and tested out this thesis, were taken aback a little. There were 2 very bad movies made in the mid-'90s about 2 Miami narcotics detectives called Bad Boy 1 and 2. These were the three bad boys of American diplomacy. When I asked each of them whether or not they belonged in the same category, Kissinger wondered whether Jimmy Carter belonged there. Jimmy Carter wondered about whether Kissinger's tactics were ethical, and everybody seemed to like Jim Baker. But these three had something in common, despite the accomplishments and the different challenges that they face. Number three, the key to being an effective brick maker has many different aspects. But one key theme that runs throughout, and it's politically incorrect, I would argue it's the best kept secret of our diplomacy, is our relationship with the Israelis. We alone, for a number of reasons, have something no one else in the international system has. The trust and confidence of the one country whose cooperation is essential to this process. When we use this special relationship wisely, combining empathy and toughness, always looking out for America's interests, we can succeed. When we don't use it wisely, and we allow the special to become the exclusive, we fail. And I would submit to you, since I've written publicly about it, and it cost me an interview with the only president that I did not succeed in interviewing, Bill Clinton. I interviewed Jerry Ford before he died, Jimmy Carter, and George H.W. Bush. I wrote an op-ed in May of '05 called Israel's Lawyer, in which I made a very elemental point. If you want to be an effective mediator, your client is an agreement. And you become advocates and attorneys, if you will, for both sides. You do not become an advocate for one side or the other. And I pointed out in this op-ed that too many senior officials, including myself, for too many years had essentially functioned as the advocate of only one side. This article created quite a stir, and it cost me an interview. But nonetheless, it's true. It's absolutely true. And the moans and groans from the pro-Israeli community notwithstanding, that somehow we're about to sacrifice Israel's relationship on the altar of Arab-Israeli peacemaking security, it's all nonsense. We have an extraordinarily close relationship with a tiny country living in a very dangerous neighborhood. That relationship is not going to be jeopardized as a consequence of effective American mediation on an interest that is critical to our national security. Two additional points, and I'm going to conclude. Domestic politics. Nobody writes about this. Anthony Lake told me that talking about domestic politics is like sex to the Victorians. It's on everybody's mind, but nobody wants to talk about it. The fact is, we have to talk about it. So rather than preach about it, I decided I would go out and interview the lobby and the lobbied. So I went out and talked to just about everybody. I talked to key Jewish leaders. I talked to key Arab Americans. I interviewed most of the key evangelical leaders in the United States, including Jerry Falwell before he died, Pat Robertson, and Ralph Reed, Gary Bauer, and traveled to San Antonio to spend 4 or 5 hours with John Hagee and to witness his Night to Honor Israel, which is an extraordinary event. Extraordinary event. And here's what I've concluded. Domestic politics has a powerful voice, but not a veto over America's Middle East policy. When a strong president decides to lead, as Nixon and Kissinger, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and Baker, when they decide to lead, domestic interests follow, sometimes angrily, sometimes noisily, but they follow. There is no conspiracy here. The U.S.-Israeli relationship has worked itself into the fabric of American psychology, American politics, for many different reasons, value affinity, and I would argue to you it's now unshakable. And there's nothing wrong with that if, in fact, we use the special relationship the way we should and not allow it to drive the train. My friend Steve Spiegel wrote a book many years ago called The Other Arab-Israeli Conflict, in which he argued that there's another conflict, the struggle for influence and power in Washington between Israel's supporters and detractors. That conflict is over. It's over. There is no politician or political figure in America today that is viable without being good on Israel, not because of Jewish votes and Jewish money. And there's no question that AIPAC runs a very effective congressional lobby, which keeps aid levels to Israel up, which passes pro-Israeli resolutions, but it does not dominate the executive branch. And I'll say it again, it's a critical ingredient to keep in mind. When presidents lead, domestic political interests follow. Finally, solutions. I wish I could offer some. I do not believe that a conflict-ending solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is possible, parens now. I think by the end of this year, with or without American diplomacy, there is a reasonable chance that two guys, Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert, for their own reasons, could agree on a piece of paper which for the first time reaches a general agreement on the four core issues that drive the conflict: borders, Jerusalem, refugees, and security. Because there is no Annapolis process. There is none. What there is a remarkable relationship between a Palestinian president and an Israeli prime minister, the first ever, in which they are seriously talking, negotiating, and I suspect drafting formulations to cover this. Whether the text can overcome the context, however, seems to me to be the real problem. And finally, not to leave you too depressed, the first American president to impress himself on my consciousness was Jack Kennedy. I was 13 when he was assassinated, which is frankly a sad comment these many years on American presidents and their capacity to inspire and to lead. But Jack Kennedy, and I know Jack Kennedy, described himself as an idealist without illusion. It is my view that anybody seriously interested in helping to analyze and negotiate this conflict has to be an idealist without illusion. Never give up on the capacity and the possibility that these conflicts can be resolved. But as you guide American policy in the next 10 years, make sure you do it with your eyes wide open. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was in 15 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Now you know why you should read the book. Aaron has really written a remarkable book. It comes in a season in which the lessons learned from the past are being excavated and written about and talked about on television and in various books that are coming out. This is the season of reflection in America. Almost identical time when Aaron's book came out is the U.S. Institute of Peace's book, co-edited by Dan Kurtzer, former ambassador to Israel and lots of places, and Scott Lewinsky, which is entitled Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace. I'm not selling that book. I just want to remind you that it's there because it, like the predecessor that the U.S. Institute of Peace produced under my guidance way back in 1991, Making Peace Between Arabs and Israelis, all three of these essentially have the same lessons. For the last 40 years, people who've looked carefully at the way we've negotiated about Arab-Israeli peace, the guys who really did the negotiation under the leadership of these bad guys, and some of the more recent ones, came to almost the same conclusions. Aaron has something rather special, though. It's not an academic tome, and it's not a documentation. He doesn't have a single footnote, by the way, which is great. He does have a few biographical things here and there. But this book is very different than any of the other lessons learned exercises going on around town. There's some in the works. Aaron was for a long time a real insider in this process under, as he likes to say, 6 presidents, I think, or 6 secretaries of state. And as a historian by training, having been an insider and being a remarkably honest guy, he has the luxury, and has provided us readers with the luxury, of real self-criticism, along with a lot of quite daring lèse-majesté toward a number of our national leaders recently. Even the bad guys who are the heroes, Kissinger, Carter, and Baker, have their flaws mentioned and sometimes elaborated on. Aaron's book focuses on America's role in this conflict. He doesn't pretend it's a complete history of the last 40 years, because a complete history of this up and down roller coaster role the U.S. has played in Middle East peacemaking would require equal time devoted to an analysis of the roles of the Arabs and the Israelis. Oh, he talks about those, obviously. But the focus is on the Americans, and that makes, in a sense, an overemphasis on American mistakes. I was glad he made the point just now that, in fact, our failures many times have not been our failures. They've been the inability of others to do things that we maybe correctly thought should be done. This is a problem where everybody has a lot of responsibility, the Americans, the Arabs, and the Jews, for the failures and for the successes when they've come along. And I'd love to see a book written with Aaron's candor and perception and analysis skills by an Israeli and by an Arab. The Israelis do a lot of this, but not as well as this book does. Arabs almost rarely ever do it. At least it doesn't get in English if they do. Aaron mentioned the domestic front. In many respects, the most unique part of this book is Chapter 3, entitled Israel's Lawyers, How Domestic Politics Shapes America's Anti-Arab-Israeli Diplomacy. Now, there's been a lot of writing about the role of the lobby. This has been a season of analysis of the lobby. I have never read anything that I thought was more honest, more balanced, and more accurate than the way Aaron analyzes the role of the Jewish and Christian worlds in America's Middle East policy making. If only that chapter were this book, it would be worth a tremendous amount. And of course he'll be attacked for it. If it weren't so good, it wouldn't deserve attack. One of the nice things about the book is he makes really very clear to all of us why we have a permanent U.S. requirement in our own national interest to care about this impossible problem. Even when the prospects are very dim, caring about it and working at it is the best way to minimize the violence and the danger to American interests, even when you can't succeed in peacemaking. His attention is focused on the presidents and on their secretaries of state, but particularly the personalities of these people. And that focus, I think, is all very wise, because in no part of the world does the personality of the decision maker make as much difference. And even when he contrasts, perhaps unfairly on occasion, one president to another, I think from knowing some of them, he really gets at the essence of the character, nature of their policymaking and what determined their successes as well as their shortcomings. And those contrasts in the book among the administrations are truly brilliantly done. If I had one criticism of the book, it would be that because of the approach he took, focusing on the personalities and the role of the presidents, he really only refers to in passing to what I think he agrees with, probably, but certainly to me are very important constraints on any president's ability to solve this really incredibly complicated mixture of dilemmas that we face. He referred to it when he said, "No bricks without straw." Unless and until the situation is one which Bill Zartman over at SICE likes to call a hurting stalemate, there's no straw. Both parties have to both feel that it's a lot more painful to stay where they are than to run these huge risks of taking great chances on changing. That's the first condition. And it wasn't always there, by any means, when we were making our major efforts. And then, of course, the second condition is you've got to have political leaders among the Arabs and Israelis who are sufficiently in command of their own politics to drag their people with them to tough decisions and compromises. You had them in Begin and Sadat. We haven't had them very often since. And we don't have them now. And then, of course, you have to have that secret pre-negotiation, the Dayan Tohami example of the Egyptian negotiations, or the Oslo, some of the Oslo business. Secret pre-negotiations carried on sometimes for years in order to convince the leader, the tough leader, that there is a deal possible that I can sell to my people. And obviously one of the things, as Aaron points out, in connection with Camp David II, the end of the Clinton administration, was that the secret diplomacy, which there had been quite a lot of, Stockholm being the latest example, had not gotten gelled to the point where you could say to Arafat or to Barak, this deal is ready now, it's cooked. You can bring it out in the public and run the risk of having a political upheaval at home because we can make it. It wasn't ready. And then one other condition he doesn't make much of in the book, though he makes a bit of it. You really have to have more support from the external players, particularly in this era of the Arab League players. And some of the European players as well, but particularly the Arab players. We didn't have that before Camp David II. We didn't make any effort to get it. And that was one of the reasons Arafat was not about to make any deals about Jerusalem, along with a lot of other reasons. But with those conditions and some others in mind, I think you'd have to say that the prospects for the next phase, whether it's with a new administration or a continuation of this one in slightly different personality, the prospects are not very good because none of those conditions have really been met at present on the Palestinian front or on the Syrian front. So I think you have to be soberly pessimistic, and Aaron's concluding chapter puts the best possible face on the future. He's got to be, because he's a real diplomat and peacemaker, what diplomats all have to be. You have to believe that you can take an impossible problem and find a way to make it better. Otherwise, you won't get up in the morning. It's too tough a job. And that's what Aaron's last chapter is. That's the chapter to convince you it's worth getting up again and again and again. And go out and buy the book while you're up.
This is what we're talking about. You know, at every book event, the sophisticated ones like this, the author does not feel that it's right for you to take a look at the book. So you go to a bookstore, this is what it looks like. But I'm not the author, but I've done this before. This is what the book is, and it's so well worth reading. I'm honored to be on this platform with Hala, who's gone through what we all know, and we take our hats off to her. Erin, who's written a marvelous book. Marvelous book. You ought to be very proud of it. And Sam, who was my idol in the diplomatic world. This book, for me as a journalist, brings me as close as I'm going to get back to the Kissinger shuttle. And I say that because it's an opportunity to get inside the process, but not in such a way that you're hypnotized by process, but you do understand, as Erin does very well, that there are people involved here. And some people want to do things in a certain way, others don't. And I say the Kissinger shuttle also, and pick up the point that Sam made at the very end about how difficult it is to bring not peace to the Middle East. I don't think that's a good goal. Bring accommodation to the Middle East. Try not to think about it as peace in the sense of there it is in heaven, and the colors are beautiful, and everybody's happy. Think of it rather as a reluctant accommodation, so that people on both sides of an incredibly difficult problem can find it in their interest to take a step forward toward the other side, and the other side to take a step forward this way, so that you begin a process. I remember vividly on Kissinger's first stop, on his first shuttle, in the fall of 1973. I believe his first stop was in Rabat, Morocco. And the king welcomed him at the airport. And then there was an honor guard of very tall Berber-type people, each with a sword. So on each side, as Kissinger walked down the aisle, there were these very tall people with swords meeting over his head. And I'm telling you, he felt at any moment that one of those swords was going to drop and decapitate him. And then we went on through another stop. So when we got to Saudi Arabia, he was really nervous. And he walked back to where the press was in the back of the plane. And he looked at me. He looked at Bernie Wertzman of the Times. He looked at Marilyn Berger of the Washington Post, shook his head, and he said, "You all get off last." And then he pointed to Bob Keatley of the Wall Street Journal, tall, blonde, blue-eyed. He said, "You get off first." At which point I had the nerve to say, "In which case, Henry, let Joe Sisko get off before you." But he was really very nervous. And remember, you have to be an idealist, but one with hope. This was a Jew born in Germany representing the United States and a Secretary of State. And he was going there at a time when at any moment, and it happened very shortly thereafter, the Arabs were going to use their oil weapon. And let's remember that those were very tough times, and yet he went into it thinking that it could be done. In the same way that Jimmy Carter felt that it could be done, and he did it. I don't share the enthusiasm that Erin has for Jim Baker, because in my book anyway, I'm not sure that I see that what he did measures up to what Carter and Kissinger did. But nevertheless, he was a fine Secretary of State, and if you liked him, that's perfectly fine with me. What I am trying to say here, as not a scholar, but as a reporter who cares deeply about this story and cares deeply about the people involved in it. I have met probably more Israelis than I have met Arabs, but I have met many, many Arabs and many, many Palestinians whom I would regard as friends, people who have essentially the same value system that I think I was raised with. One of the wonderful things about this book is that Erin can both analyze and personalize some of these dilemmas and some of these problems. When he talks about domestic politics and talking about the U.S., one of my colleagues at Harvard, Walt, and someone I've never met, Mearsheimer, when they did their book, I was asking myself whether it would be a bestseller. I didn't read the book, but I read the article. And I was thinking to myself, well, I doubt it, but then 10 minutes later I would say, sure. Because if you can say to an American audience that the Israel lobby has captured the U.S. government and in effect is the single most important thing in determining what American policy is going to be, maybe there are enough people out there who believe it. What Aaron has done in this remarkable chapter is to point out what he has already told us here, and that is that if there is a strong American leader pushing a policy that is clear, that can get on the evening news and sell itself, then that president and that Secretary of State may worry about the strength of a lobby, but will not be deterred from pursuing a policy that he or they regard as essential to the national interest of this country. I was shocked that the Walt Mearsheimer book actually became a bestseller in this country. But I believe that this is the kind of book that ought to be a bestseller, not because it's taking a different line, although that's part of it, but because what Aaron has clearly tried to do with this book is explain something that is so frightfully complicated and emotional at every level. When Golda Meir would turn to Henry Kissinger and say, Henry, how can you do this to us? You're Jewish. And then he would have to say, but Madam Prime Minister, please understand, I'm the Secretary of State of the United States of America. And that means that is what is central. And that is indeed what is central. To him, to Aaron, to anybody who's been involved in this process. Just the other day, one of Aaron's colleagues, Dennis Ross, said in answer to a question about this issue, he said that his experience, he does not know of a single case where pressure of a domestic sort determined the policy of the United States, not a single case. And I assume, I'm reading from your chapter 3, that you essentially agree with that. Let me conclude with this thought. Aaron says that since 91, nothing lasting has lasted. Well, I don't quite buy that for two reasons. One, I think that there was a peace treaty that was signed between an Arab country and Israel after 91, wasn't there? Jordan?
Yes, there was.
And that seems to me something, we can have that. And that seems to me something worthwhile mentioning. And second, I think that when you're dealing with the Middle East, and you think in terms of soundbite history, that things have to happen quickly, or that there even does have to be peace at the end of the road. I think you might be missing the boat there. I think that in the Middle East, things walk slowly, and things develop slowly. But in recent decades, think about what has happened. It is so easy to be negative. It is so easy to say nothing lasting has really lasted. But what we see really up until 73, I think, and you will both three of you correct me if I'm wrong here, but up until 73, we really didn't have any kind of serious negotiating between the Israelis and the Arabs. It just didn't happen. Golda Meir may slip off and see King Hussein in a London hotel every now and then, but a serious, sustained negotiation did not happen. The United States was not involved in a serious diplomatic way until that point. Since 73, which is, after all, 35 years, what has happened? There are 2 peace treaties between Israel and Arab countries. There is an active negotiation underway between Israel and the Palestinians. It may not function according to George Bush's timetable, that you've got to get there by the end of this year, but it's functioning. Something is going on. People are talking to each other. I think that given the realities of the Middle East, we have really done quite well, and that we may even do a lot better if we are very well informed, very patient, but idealistic, absolutely determined, of the view that it can happen, and get out there and do it.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions, and if there are questions from the overflow, we'll take them too. Yes, please, just wait for the microphone too. Just 1 second.
My name is Frank Fletcher. My question is to Mr. Miller. What do you think led to the failure to conclude during the Clinton administration the Israeli-Palestinian peace? I'm sure it wasn't one factor, but I'm sure that you have something to say about that.
Yeah, I'll sum it up very quickly. There are 3 schools of thought on Camp David. One is the orthodoxy, that Prime Minister Barak put the best offer that any Palestinian would ever see on the table. Arafat rejected it and went to violence. There are the revisionists who argue that's wrong, and the blame and responsibility should be distributed, maybe not equitably, but distributed between the 3 actors, Arafat, Barak, and Clinton. And then there are the determinists. I'm that school. In July of 2000, there was the chances of reaching an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians in a 2-week summit at Camp David on the 4 core issues that drove their conflict. The chances of doing that were slim to none, with an emphasis on the none. And forget Mr. Arafat's culpability or Mr. Barak's, but I'll speak as an American. We did not respect the issues. We did not understand fully what the mutual requirements and needs of each side were to reach what Mr. Barak wanted, which was a conflict-ending agreement. A conflict-ending agreement in which all claims and irredenta would finally be laid to rest. The chances of doing that in July of 2000 were virtually non-existent. And second, we allowed the summit to run us. We didn't run it. And when I say there's a lesson for ignoring history, it may well be that Camp David I only concluded on the 12th or 13th day. But the odds of reaching an agreement between Begin and Sadat on Sinai settlements, oil fields, and airfields were much greater, given the personalities of the two and the controlling nature of an American president, than what we faced. My friend Tom Friedman says you can't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. It's a fair point, and Tom's absolutely right. But there are some tickets, I would argue Iraq may be among them, that are simply too expensive, too fraught with difficulty, and the consequences of failure are too catastrophic to want to purchase. And with all the best intentions in the world, we tried to buy a ticket. And it was not the right decision.
A question from the overflow, maybe Sam and Marvin would care to take that, and also Aaron. Why did several congressmen ask President Jimmy Carter to apologize for his book about the apartheid of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Sam?
Well, I think the problem is that this book, Carter's more recent book, suffers a lot from a lack of an editor. Jimmy Carter doesn't like to use editors. chose a title. He said deliberately in public, I chose a title because I wanted to sell a lot of books and get their attention. The title meant Palestine, was where the apartheid was, but, you know, it's fair to understand that many Jewish readers might think it applies to Israel, and Israel, after all, is the occupying power. Ever since Carter was enormously even-handed in the way he ran his diplomacy, although he had to grit his teeth a lot of the time. But he was remarkable. After he left office, some of his very strong sympathies for the Palestinian condition came out more and more in everything he said and did over the years, and he became more and more public in his frustrations with the feeling that Israel had actually cost him the full peace that he would have achieved had he been re-elected for another term. Because you may remember the Jewish vote turned against him in New York in that re-election campaign, and he always blamed that on Israel. And I think it's understandable, therefore, that his language has become more and more weighted on the side of worrying about the Palestinians and giving just kind of a brief mention to the Israeli dilemmas. So for a Jewish reader, it's a hard book to read.
Morgan, do you care to?
No, that-
Okay. Yes, please. Could I ask you to identify yourself?
Sure. I'm Greg Squires from George Washington University. Aaron, it seems to me one could argue that in Iraq we see a lot of toughness and idealism at work, and it's not working too well. I guess I'd like to ask you, in the current presidential campaign, where do you see the best hope for the right mix of toughness and idealism coming if there's going to be any progressive movement in the next 4 years?
It's the hole that we've dug for ourselves is very deep. And I think the first requirement is for any new president, Republican or Democrat, that we essentially we stop digging. I mean, Iraq is an example of the threat which was worst cased at the outset and the outcome which was best cased. And as a consequence of that, we have pursued a policy, in my judgment, that has proven today to be a galactic failure. Rarely in the end, I mean, I don't think there is an example in the history of our foreign policy of an operation that has cost us so much. Now, the real question in the end is whether the costs will be worth, the sacrifice will be worth the outcome. And I can't speak to that issue. What I know is that we are in an investment trap. And I do not believe that any Democratic president who tells you, candidate, who tells you that he or she plans for an expeditious withdrawal from Iraq, I think they are either not thinking this through clearly or are willfully misleading. Because it's almost inconceivable to me that we will have an expeditious, quick, and speedy withdrawal for any number of reasons. I'm arguing for a tough and smart American foreign policy in a part of the world that has become critically important to our interests. I mean, in the end, the greatest challenge facing America, if you believe that the organizing premise of a nation's foreign policy is protecting the homeland, if you can't protect your homeland, you don't need a foreign policy. And that threat is not going to come from an ascendant China. It's not going to come from an economically powerful and united Europe. It's not going to come from a former Soviet Union seeking to regain its past glory. It's going to come from an area of the world which is dysfunctional in the extreme, in which there is tremendous rage and anger and humiliation with respect to the United States, and where weapons of mass destruction could conceivably proliferate. That's the area. That's the generational challenge. And last point, we got to stop thinking in terms of administrations and start thinking in terms of strategies that last at least a generation.
Yes, in the back.
Two brief questions. It's the chicken or the egg situation? Is it the response to American pressure that will basically force an agreement with each leader saying the Americans made us do it, or is it a rise of leaders capable with the political and internal strengths necessary to reach an agreement that will lead to American brokering? And my second question is this a role only as far as applying external mediation, midwifery, or pressure? Is this a role that only the United States can play, or are there other nations that whose time might have come to essentially replace the United States as a external peacemaker?
I'll just take a piece of
Piece
that.
of it, and then
A
maybe
piece of
Marvin
that.
and Sam will also take
I
it.
mean, I
please.
make
No?
clear in this
Okay.
book over and over and over again that our phone rang, at least for the 20 years I was involved in negotiations, and I'm sure that Kissinger and Carter would attest that their phone rang, and that our phone still rings, despite the absence of credibility and the imperfections in our policy. It rings on the Arab-Israeli issue for one reason. We have one special asset that no other organization or power has ever had, has now, and in my judgment, will ever have. And that is the prospect of gaining the trust of both the Israelis and the Arabs. You cannot be a mediator in this conflict unless you enjoy the trust and the confidence of both sides. My European colleagues used to complain. We wanted them to be the payers, while America was the player. Well, the reality is, I'm not a student of architecture, but form follows function. There was a reason that our phone rang. And the reason was that we alone had the trust and confidence that on several occasions actually helped produce an Israeli-Arab negotiating process and an agreement. That is still the key, the unspoken key, to our interests. We succeed in this peacemaking when we do, not in spite of our relationship with the Israelis, but because of it. And you've got to honestly face up to that question. But then you also have to honestly face up to the reality that the special relationship can get out of whack. It can become exclusive. And when it becomes exclusive, with empathy and not toughness, with no reciprocity, then we get off track and our interests suffer. So it's fine to look after Israeli interests. They're an ally. But every time we do, we need to make sure that we look after American interests as well. It's so fundamentally simple.
Let me say a word about the first part of the question. I think history shows we do not produce the leaders that have to make the peace. The parties produce them or they don't produce them. If they get produced by their political systems, then an American president can have a major effect on helping them achieve something important. But every time we try to control somebody else's politics, we screw it up. We're showing that right now in various places in the world.
Just a quick answer. You seem to suggest, if I understood you right, that it's either one or the other. It's either the players or the United States. And in my experience, it's never been just the players, because even in the time that Aaron mentioned in his talk, when the Palestinians and the Israelis met in Norway and struck their deal, and then we got informed about it, it wouldn't have happened without us. There was in the negotiation an expectation on both sides that the United States at a certain moment would come in and provide that embrace that Clinton instinctively felt on the lawn of the White House when Arafat was there with Rabin, and he sort of reached over and tried to bring the two of them together. There was reluctance on both sides, but he did bring them together. And that kind of American role, I think, is essential, that understanding with some distance.
Thank you very much. I see there are many hands up and there are questions from the overflow, but we have run out of time. Please join us outside for a book signing and the reception, and thanking our panelists.